And there we go. We're now being recorded. So, welcome to a special early Halloween horror edition of the Wireside Chat. And I'm Melissa, and I are thrilled to have with us tonight three instructors from our program who are experts, I would say, in the horror genre. First, we have Mary SanGiovanni, is an award-winning American. She is an award-winning American horror and thriller writer of nearly 20 books, including the forthcoming Alien, Enemy of My Enemy, as well as short stories, comics, and nonfiction. Her work has been translated internationally. She has a master's degree in writing popular fiction from Seton Hill University, Pittsburgh, and is currently a co-host of the Ghostwriters podcast. Born and raised in New Jersey, she currently resides in Pennsylvania. Excuse me. Also with us is Sidney Williams, who is the author of several novels, including Dark Hours and Disciples of the Serpent, a Lovecraftian thriller. His latest spooky story is called By Side Saddle, and it will appear next year in an anthology called Unknown Heroes versus the Forces of Darkness. As of this year, he has been teaching creative writing for a decade, so congratulations on that milestone. And then we have L. Marie Wood. Is an award-winning dark fiction author, screenwriter, and poet with novels in the psychological horror, mystery, and dark romance genres. She won the Golden Stake Award for her novel, The Promise Keeper. She is a MICO Award-nominated screenwriter and has won Best Horror, Best Action, Best Afrofuturism, Horror, Sci-Fi, and Best Short Story Screenplay Awards in both national and international film festivals. Wood's short fiction has been published in groundbreaking works, including the Bram Stoker Award finalist anthology Sycorax's Daughters and Slay, Stories of the Vampire Noir. Wood is also an English and creative writing professor and a horror scholar. So we're just like thrilled to have this distinguished panel of experts and awesome writers with us tonight to help us talk a little bit about the spooky season, as our guest Michael referred to it. So I'm just gonna throw it open by asking a simple yet probably annoying question, which is like, how do you define horror? What separates horror from other genres? Because it's often lumped into, say, speculative fiction, but I think it has its own characteristics. So maybe some of you could talk a little bit about that.
That's funny. That's a point of contention for me that it's lumped into this speculative fiction umbrella. And I used to talk about that a lot. And I think I've stopped talking about that quite a bit because it's kind of just like me and five people discussing that. I think that it is distinct. It's different. I mean, the intention, to answer your question, the intention of horror is to frighten. And other genres don't have that as their main focus. They may frighten. That might be something they consider doing on, as a secondary thing. But for horror, the goal is to scare, and so on whatever level, but still that's the first focus. And so I think that sometimes when we get into the speculative fiction umbrella, it can be watered down and we become a subgenre of this bigger thing when we really are our own genre. So, but again, I said I wasn't going to get on that soapbox unless you all want to.
It's too late. It's too late. You're on the soapbox.
Well, I will say I think it is very distinct. And what I have often told students is that most fiction is about what's going to happen next. Horror is about, oh my God, don't let that happen.
Yeah, good one.
It is about dread and worrying and wondering what that sound is out there in the darkness. And
that's a good point. It does share some elements of speculative fiction in that there's the speculation on what would happen. But yeah, no, I agree with Lisa and Sidney both that the point is to scare, to horrify, sometimes to disgust, but depending on the type, and it's both, I think, a genre of what we don't want to happen and sometimes what's already happened. Yes. And how people react to it. I think the atmosphere and the ultimate purpose are what distinguish horror from, say, something like dark fantasy, or even from something like a paranormal romance, where you could have vampires in both, but the point of them in horror is to elicit a reaction of dread or fear.
Yeah, I think that emotion, showcasing that emotion or highlighting that emotional response is something that is helpful in thinking about horror. Sometimes you hear horror being kind of divided into two types. There's horror that makes use of a supernatural element, horror that does not make use of a super. I mean, that's probably one of the scariest books I've ever read, at least insofar as the effect that it had upon me was Helter Skelter.
Yeah.
I mean, that just a terrifying work of, like, I guess you would call it like nonfiction horror or something. But when you think about horror as a genre that is all about eliciting a certain emotions in the reader, then that kind of distinction between supernatural and non-supernatural horror becomes less important.
I think that, historically there was some debate that the non-supernatural was actually horror versus thriller, but I think we've moved past that, and we can acknowledge things like Psycho, kind of took us across the threshold, and now we absolutely can have horror with the human monster as the threat.
Right. So the monster is an important facet of horror, of the horror genre, whether that monster is a supernatural thing or ourselves.
Right. And I think that some authors throughout time, because when you mentioned that, Sidney, it brought to mind Beloved and Toni Morrison's thought about her own work and it not being horror fiction. But I'm like, anyone who reads this is going to beg to differ.
It definitely has that
it's a
impact.
human monster for specific reasons, right? I mean, but it was a horrific thing that happened. The whole thing is just horrific, and it's painful on so many different levels, and all of those tick the boxes for horror, So I think that we really, it's a viewpoint that sometimes authors who are not entrenched in it, like I've always been a horror author, there's no denying that for me, but if you kind of stumble into it and write this really creepy, amazing thing, you may not, but you were a thriller author traditionally, you might not grab onto this distinction with as much gusto as I do, and that continues to perpetuate this confusion and this us versus them, a separation of genre, if you will. And that's when you think about it, it's really all marketing and wording, labeling. So it's kind of frustrating when you get to that point.
It is, and I think we are finally beginning to move past the point of horror being treated as a genre that's over there and that we don't talk about as much or whatever. Its merits are being recognized more and more happily.
And is that I'm sorry, Mary, go ahead.
I was agreeing. I think the intent with thrillers is generally its pacing and plot, but with horror, like Lisa said, the emotional impact is really, I think, in the forefront, which means characters sometimes tend to be more of a focus than the plot, which is, I think, why I mean, if there needed to be a distinction, but like Lisa said, there's a bit of crossover, and it always bothered me when people would eschew the title of horror writer when that's primarily what they're writing, because, as Sidney said, it wasn't always a very popular genre to belong to, because horror is capable of incredibly emotionally impactful things, beautiful things, along with the horrific, just these beautiful concepts. And to me, horror was always a genre that looked at, in the face of tragedy or a crisis, the best that a human being could become. Sometimes, granted, it's also about the worst a human being could become, but it's a transcendent experience. And I think that makes horror a lot more powerful than people give it credit for, particularly, in the broader world out there, in other media, horror-related media.
Well, there have been many debates about why is horror popular if it is about bad things. And, one conclusion, I think it's Noel Carroll in The Philosophy of Horror, concludes that it ultimately produces a sense of awe because there are, these fantastical things that we experience or whatever out of darkness. And that is, I think that also kind of aligns with Stephen King's definition of the highest level of horror. I think the terror is his highest level,
Yes.
where it is, not just that there's bad things or supernatural things or there are gross things, but that there is, something that just makes us look at the world suddenly in a new way.
Right.
And so
Those things
capability
inspire
is
awe.
fantastic.
Yeah, and
I mean,
they inspire hope and resilience. Really,
that reminds
I
me
think
of
people need to know that.
it reminds me a little of Rilke. His concept of angels. Every angel is terrifying. It's like a confrontation with something, as you put it, transcendent. And oftentimes our response to that is, at least initially, one of terror.
I would submit that it also provides the escapism in the same way that fantasy and science fiction and romance do. It's just a little different. It's kind of pick your fancy. How do you want to escape?
Right.
Because supernatural, I mean, there are no vampires. I mean, not like Bram Stoker's Dracula. That we don't have that, right? There are no zombies. There are not in real life. There are no beings like that. So therefore you can escape and just have fun being afraid by something and running with this character and running through the book, and it's completely separated from your life because your daily life you're not encountering a zombie on the corner, just like you're not encountering a dragon on the corner. So when you make it real, I mean, we have realistic horror, we all know this. If there's subgenres within our genre that have that, but if you're reading a mystery or a thriller and it's about a murder that could have actually really happened in real life, it's not so fantastical that it's not a real scenario. The escapism is a little different because for me, if it could really happen, now I'm terrified of it. If you give me something that can't happen, I'm just going to enjoy the story. So I think people need to consider that.
I think I can find myself still scared by the supernatural, but I'm less, I'm more my adult self. When I'm more my adult self, I'm less scared of that. But I also think, that's where some of the old monsters kind of have gravitated toward the paranormal romance and things, and they can still be enjoyed and they can still be catalysts. But maybe, we look for new things that scare us. And of course, historically, it's the rule of thumb. The unknown is what is, most terrifying. And I think also, and I don't remember who said this, it's not original with me, but that horror sometimes begins as horror. And then once we know the threat, it becomes thriller as we deal with the thriller. And has anybody seen Barbarian? I don't want to spoil. I won't spoil anything.
I haven't seen
Not
it
yet. No,
But
not yet.
Barbarian, that really I was reminded of that because there are several twists in Barbarian, and the most unsettling portion of that to me is when you don't know and you don't know what's coming. And so I think things can be tiered.
Right.
Yeah.
Because that's suspense.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And suspense is in both. It's in both. I think it's like they said I think it was Aliens, where she says, if we know what it is, we can kill it. And if we can identify it, we can kill it. I think that for horror, if it's supernatural, I think it appeals to some, I don't know, primal archetype or child part of us. Like Sidney was saying, the grown-up part of you is really more scared, I think, of the things that reflect what we're reading in the news, or like where human monsters are the problem. And there's something sort of, I don't know, like reflective of society, where we're looking more at like society's ills. The supernatural, I think, appeals to that superstitious part of us that still checks behind us if you're walking down a hallway and it's dark and you're by yourself. I mean, you're by yourself, intellectually you're by yourself, or that part of you that, doesn't want to stay on the 13th floor of a hotel. It's that little bit of what if, which is speculative. It's present in all speculative fiction, but to me, like for me personally, I find that more escapist, because it's like Lisa, it's how you process horror, but you do it differently depending on the subgenre you're reading. You're either processing real life horrors or you're processing ancient archetype horrors.
Let me jump into the chat where we have a question or kind of a reflection that I think is interesting to think about and maybe talk about a little bit, from Michael, who says there's a kind of self-reflection that happens with horror where we see what frightens us, and that says something about who we are and what it means to be human.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think that's true, very true.
Mm-hmm.
Like for what I mostly what I write primarily is cosmic horror, so like Lovecraftian kind of stuff. And one of the things that I think appeals to me about it is that sense, like Sidney said, of the unknown. The oldest, Lovecraft said, the oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown. There's a certain nihilistic, I think, ideology in cosmic horror, which I don't personally subscribe to, but I find sort of fascinating, because to me, cosmic horror sort of it embodies what I love about horror, which is that transcendent nature of it, that fluidity of reality, where things can change. And in studying some of the work, like Michael said in the chat, there is a self-reflective element of it, because we pride ourselves, I think, on thinking that we have a purpose and that our lives have meaning to somebody somewhere. And cosmic horror and horror in general, I think, really sort of strains that idea. Like, are you sure? Are you sure you matter? Are you sure that you have a real purpose here other than to be, horror fodder for whatever the monster happens to be? And there is an element of self-reflection, both, I think, on a personal psychological level and also on a societal level. Again, I think kind of depending on subgenre, but yeah, absolutely, there is a self-reflective element in horror that I think is important.
And I think it kind of forces that. And of course, Lovecraft's notion that the universe was indifferent is, embodied in his sense of cosmic horror. And there's an old poem, I think it's a poem. I don't remember who said it, but it's like a man said to the universe, "Sir, I exist," and the universe said, "Yes, but that has not created in me any sense of obligation." And,
Interesting.
and that is very much horror. Horror doesn't care. You're something, as you said, you're something to be stepped on if you're Cthulhu or whoever.
Yeah, I think that horror has definitely, and I think we can all attest to this. I mean, horror has looked at the world with this critical lens and given creators an opportunity to sort of just write a story that has its finger on the pulse of whatever's going on. So in that, you see that it's self-reflective. It's reflective of the world. It's reflective of the community. It's so many different things that I, as writers, all of us, it doesn't matter the genre, we all have a little bit of ourselves in every book. I mean, whether it's a character, a little piece of something, it doesn't matter what it is. You can't really help it, right? But horror allows us to go further and say, all right, well, if I am wondering, especially my genre is psychological horror. So the idea of, did I see that? Or is that, some sort of manifestation, or is there something happening to me? Or is that really going on in front of me and I'm the only one who sees it? And then the question, of course, why? and then that answer can go either way. And that why is kind of sometimes what is the community thinking about this thing that is so loosely related that, it's almost going to be indecipherable. However, it is like the crux of what I'm talking about in the story. Or what do I think about it? So I think that we owe, to that regard, I think that we as authors kind of owe not only the stories that chance to live and breathe, but also give the readers the opportunity to sort of deal with whatever conflict is going on and watch it play out in a way that can never happen. This is escapism again, but watch it play out in this way that is safe for them, but they can at least get to a resolution, and by the end of it they can be done with that one thing and move on to something else. I think
some other terrifying fear,
some other terrifying thing. I mean, I think that if you think about what the zombie books have done for us dealing with health concerns or dealing with things in the world, a lot of people, I mean, all you had to do is watch Netflix and see exactly how the programming changed when, our lives all changed. Programming became, I would have to deliberately not look at my main screen so that I could find some things that were not about like contagion and this, that, and the other, and all these words. And I'm like, come on, I don't want to see that, but it was there and it was so prominent because it was helping people process. And I think that's just what we do as creators. So it's absolutely self-reflective, and it should be.
I mean, do you feel that it seems to me anyway that horror is undergoing a kind of a golden age? It's becoming a lot more popular. It's achieving like a more sustainable. There have been horror booms in the past, but they could never sustain themselves. I mean, from a publishing standpoint, now that doesn't seem to be the case. And I can't help but wonder if, all the, tied into what you were just saying about horror kind of dealing with issues that are ongoing in the real world. We have a political instability. We have the possible collapse of democracy in our country and abroad. We have the truly terrifying implications of climate change. Do all of these things create the environment that's kind of, the perfect environment for the horror to thrive?
I think so. I think that horror seems to have a boom when there is political or social unrest, and we've had an awful lot of that in the last few years, and are still seeing no signs of that slowing down, unfortunately. And when there's when we conquer something, believe it or not, like if every time we solve a problem, like we've mastered, a cure for something, or we've gotten to Mars or whatever the case is, then it opens up more questions. And every time there's an unknown again, horror has a new field to play in. So I definitely think that's part of what the boom is. I think that during COVID, when everything was locked down, I think it drastically changed how we watch movies, but I think the streaming services went looking far and wide for different kinds of things, for different content, and a lot of that was horror. A lot of it was international horror, which was some of which is absolutely fantastic. And I think that people who maybe might not have given horror a chance because they think of it like as all blood and guts and not for the delicate or thoughtful types of horror that exist out there, I think they finally saw things like maybe Bird Box, Josh Malin's Bird Box, or The Lovely Bones, right? Which are absolutely horror, but maybe not necessarily marketed that way, or that aren't what they expected horror to be. And it maybe broadened our audience a little bit. People are willing to give horror a chance.
Or even a show like Dark, I'm thinking of, which like has so many different genre elements in it, but really it boils down to kind of, in my opinion anyway, kind of a horror story, because the whole I don't want to give anything away, but like the structural setup of the whole thing is just so like sadistic. It's just it fills you with dread, but you can't stop watching.
Mhm.
That's the other thing about horror, isn't it? It's like
You can't
it
look
does
away.
fill you with dread, but you
Right.
cannot look away. Well,
What a
why?
sequel.
And why is that? Why can you not look away? Because in the movie theater, you're always seeing people going, I can't watch,
I think we have to know it's going to be okay. It's like, and this is, I apologize if this comes across as an insensitive example, but it's like a car accident. There's always rubbernecking when there's a car accident, not because we want to necessarily see the gore of an accident, but on some level, maybe we need to see it and need to see that it's going to be okay.
So that somebody's coming out of it.
That somebody's
Mhm.
coming out of it,
Mhm.
that ultimately the world rights itself again, because so many times, you read the horrible headlines about like people hurting children, or, people being displaced, or taken away from families, or just these random senseless acts of violence. And there is no rebalancing that we can see. There's no justice or fairness that we can see. And I think that in horror, as maybe as much as we want to look away, we need to look back again, because the reason we're engaging in that experience, I think honestly, the reason we even write about those kinds of experiences is to balance the world out again, to say that yes, this horrible thing happened, but look at what's going to happen to the people who committed that horrible thing.
And yeah, ultimately there is that catharsis of the comeback and the
Mhm.
defeat. There may be the suggestion that evil has not died, but
Right.
it is. We stay and we wait for the catharsis that's coming. That
Right. We need
payoff.
the survival element of it, that we can survive it, we can get past it, even if it doesn't have a happy ending.
So
Right.
that's interesting. Mary and Sidney have a different perspective than I do on that. I think that people are looking and can't turn away, or can't like actually close their fingers so that they're not peeking through them, is because they have to be sure there's a catharsis, and there's a search for resolution, but not quite the same. They have to be sure that it isn't as bad as they thought it was, or if it is, that they can stomach it or not. The thought of not knowing how it ended, no matter how terrifying, no matter how gruesome, whatever, is worse than having to deal with whatever that outcome is.
That's a great point, and that answers the question: why do you go into the basement? You shouldn't go down there. Why? Well, you go down there because you have to see. Is it as bad as I thought? That's a great point.
Yeah.
Honestly, that's why I watched Game of Thrones, because so many people told me it was so brutal and so violent. I mean, to tell that to a horror writer,
Right.
I'm imagining like
That's a challenge.
atrocities that you couldn't even possibly put on film. And I'm watching this, I'm like, oh yeah, that's bad, that's brutal, but that's not nearly what I thought it was. Okay,
Right.
I can handle
Exactly.
that.
You guys are a tough audience.
That's Stephen King's thing too. The knock at the door is frightening, but if you open the door and it's a 20-foot worm, you go, oh, okay, well that's fine. I was imagining a 30-foot worm.
Exactly.
This is much better. I wanted to note too that in talking about the popularity, the rising popularity, the acceptance, is that maybe there has been a wave of acceptance for decades of genre becoming more acceptable.
Yeah.
With the 60s, we saw things like Ross McDonald gain some respect as a detective writer, and with I don't know if I'm hitting all the markers, but Next Generation science fiction became not just this thing that a few weird people liked, but that more and more people embraced. And so maybe it's horror's turn.
Yeah. It is weird, because I feel like I grew up in the 60s and 70s, and I was a science fiction fan and a fantasy fan, and I feel as though I internalized a lot of the kind of critical views toward those genres that were prevalent at the time, which were very, very much, dismissive and condescending. And yet, within that space, science fiction and fantasy writers could always go like, well, at least we're not horror. They could always look down. It's important to always have some other genre to look down on. And horror sort of served that role for many other writers, I think, who should have known better, like me. Because my writing is at least horror adjacent, if not, outright horror itself. I mean, I was like, earlier this year, I was like, why am I not a member of the HWA? I mean, it just doesn't make sense. I've been a member of SIFWA for 30 years, but it never crossed my mind. And then I just started to think about all the stuff I've written. I'm like, well, shoot, that's horror. So maybe I'm a late bloomer or something, or like come to the realization late in life that, oh my God, I was a horror writer all along.
To the right table at the party.
Right. Well, yeah. Right. I mean, we've been here waiting, so I don't know. But
now I'm with all the cool kids.
I feel vindicated. We finally got Dungeons and Dragons to be cool.
That's
now
right.
we have horror be cool.
Right.
And then we will be the coolest kids on the block. Really, we'll be the OGs.
That's right. So when you're writing your own horror, are you frightened? Does it terrify you in some manner, or are you to take kind of a more coldly calculated approach to it?
It's a great question, right?
There have been scenes that I've written that I know are important for the books that they're in, but I won't reread them. In fact, if there are typos in there, I apologize. It's because I could not reread that scene again. And I was just going by, I kind of like, sort of did want to, just to make sure that, because I think that, I remember a writer telling me once, somebody who'd been doing it much longer than I had, you write well, but you write safe. And you're never really going to scare other people unless you can write about the things that make you uncomfortable too. So maybe not freaked out, scared, have to look behind me, creeped out, but I've definitely written things that have been outside my comfort zone. And I think they tend to be better than the things that are safe, for me personally.
Yeah. I do, like you say, certain scenes, I think I find myself immersed, in the situation and everything and feeling it with the characters. I think that, is maybe when it is really working and you're really in that zone. Actually, I just turned in a thriller. And interestingly, a large part of it takes place in a hurricane, and then some characters have to go outside. And I really, was exhausted when those scenes were written because, and there is the terror of the storm coming, and then the terror of being in it. And I also, a large part of one of my books takes place in a basement, and I felt like I lived there for a while.
Yes.
Yeah, I wrote something that scared me while writing it. I wrote it. I like to write at night, and I wrote it, and the house is quiet. I mean, I'm talking, it's early morning, truly. It's like 2, 3 in the morning, and the house is quiet, which never happens around here, right? The house is quiet, and it's really dark, right? No one's driving anywhere. Even the guy who gets up at 4 a.m. across the street, he still has an hour more to sleep, but I'm up writing. And I finished this thing, and it was dark outside my office, which is the only room with light on. And I was afraid to get up and walk into that because I described something. And I'm like, I can't get to the light switch. Oh my God, I'm never getting out of here. I'm just going to sleep in here. And I sat there for a couple of minutes like, come on now, are you kidding? And so I finally got up. But I ran upstairs like I was 10 years old, as opposed to, whatever age I am. I'm not giving that away. But, I ran upstairs like a kid, like something was chasing me. And then when we came down to editing it, I read it, and I literally yelled out loud. I'm like, my God, I don't think I can read it, right? Put it down. came back to it, and I'm like, now the edit has to happen at 1 p.m. because I'm like, it needs to be sunlight, there needs to be people around, I need all of it. And I'm reading it, and I'm just like, this part is really scary to me. And all I could say was, man, if it's bothering me that much, it's gonna impact somebody else.
Yeah.
I mean, and now that's our goal. If we're gonna write these scary stories, we want to make sure we can, because if I'm writing something scary about a marshmallow and marshmallows aren't scaring anyone, then no one's going to be frightened about the marshmallow, right? So I have to really tap into the thing that frightens me and put it on paper. And that one time, I couldn't believe that I avoided a specific room because I used a portion of a description of one of my rooms. And it's not, no one could identify it if they read it. It's not on the nose, but I know what I'm talking about. And I was like, I can't even go in there right now. I need to look, it needs to be light, all light. And that's when I knew it was working. Like Sidney said, that's when it's working to me. So I definitely make sure that some aspect of what I'm writing frightens me, because if it doesn't, I don't think I'm going to frighten anybody else. And like I said, I'm psychological horror, so I'm kind of quiet with it. It's not necessarily blatantly out there. I've got to make sure something sits in your head and it makes you think about it the next day. And if I can do that, it's only because it happened to me. So, yeah.
Hey, Paul, can I ask a question based on the chat?
Absolutely.
Yeah, there's a really good discussion going on in the chat about the issue of unresolved endings in a horror story. How do you feel about unresolved endings and readers not knowing how it all turns out?
Love it.
It's really scary. And I think we're more accepting of that now. I think, we build up an immunity to templates in stories, if you will. And so, I knew that was going to happen. And so, now happily we can walk into the theater or pick up a book and we don't know, we're not guaranteed there's going to be a happy ending. We're pretty much guaranteed there's going to be, connective tissue that adds up to that ending.
Right.
But, and I think that can be very terrifying.
Yes.
Well, think about a story like The Turn of the Screw. I mean, that is, to me, kind of an ultimate unresolved ending. You can argue forever about what actually is happening, whether we're talking about supernatural horror, whether we're talking about psychological horror, just, a masterwork in horror, written at a time where the genre distinctions were not as rigid as they perhaps are today, where a Henry James, can feel like he can pick up his pen and write that kind of story. But I mention that only to show that the unresolved ending has, in horror anyway, has been a kind of a staple of those stories for quite some time. And I guess a lot of ghost stories well, of course, The Turn of the Screw is a ghost story. Ghost stories are particularly apt for that kind of questioning ending, I guess. But is that a flaw in a story, to have like everything come to a point at which a reader may be expecting some kind of resolution, but instead we're left either grasping at straws or just with an ambiguity that has no solution?
I think it can be more terrifying if you don't get an answer. So
I think it depends on how we're defining unresolved. If it's a well done story, then even an ambiguous ending still has something of a resolution. Like if you think about like John Carpenter's The Thing, that has an ambiguous ending because it's spoiler alert, folks. If you haven't seen it, first of all, if you're a horror fan and you haven't seen it, you should go forth.
It's been around a few years. You had your chance.
Exactly. It's a masterwork of horror. But the ending leaves two characters, and neither one is sure about the humanity of the other. And to me, that's a very ambiguous ending.
Yeah, that's a great point. And that's a great example, because it's the unknowing that is that's where the horror lies.
And for that kind of story, it almost couldn't end any other way. Like it's almost a perfect type of story to have an ambiguous ending. If you have the kind of story that I think it was that Sidney said, that you're lacing it throughout with hints as to the direction that it's going, and then you have an ambiguous ending, people can make their own decisions about what they think that means. And sometimes that can be incredibly satisfying, to go back and rewatch it and put the little pieces together all along the way. But it has to be something that, in my opinion, that allows for an ambiguous ending to work. If you just have something that just sort of stops abruptly and hasn't earned the right to sort of stop abruptly, I think it can be frustrating and confusing. Well,
Yeah.
and I think horror that's maybe not so good does that sometimes, but there are plenty of good examples of horror doing it well. And it takes you back to the unknown again,
It does, and Kelly Link's the specialist's hat comes to mind. It's a story that builds, and it doesn't give us all the answers, but we can look back through it and find things that have been said. And to me, it makes the fear linger longer because you have to go back and keep thinking about it.
Yes,
that's right.
Yes,
that's right. That's right. And I agree wholeheartedly. My example is going to be not horror, but and not even a movie. The Sopranos ending.
Oh yeah.
Now,
Yeah.
like or lump, that ending was like amazing. Why? Because it's now a discussion piece. It's now you want to go back and watch and see if you can catch any clues in that last scene to see if they, made it out, or if they were, no, I'm sorry, I'm spoiling it for you, but did they make it out? Did they,
Right.
were they slaughtered at the table, or what? Right.
And I would say, there's been some discussion about the ending they discussed, in like this year, I think David Chase has talked about that. But I think ultimately that is a better ending than if you had gotten an answer.
Yes. That's exactly where I was going, Sidney. If you give everything away, like with psychological horror and quiet horror, we don't always give everything away. So you're kind of like right in my wheelhouse right now. We kind of let you draw some conclusions, because the goal is to have the piece linger. So you're creating the dread, you're creating this long, I don't want to call it confusion, but the open-endedness of the ending creates conversation. So this is how book clubs get to discuss, and go in depth with novels. This is how when you're watching a movie, you see an ending and you go get coffee after and you're talking about this movie. A movie that ties everything up and, just pat perfect, what happens, there's nothing to talk about after that. At least not storyline based. And if you want that to be the thing that continues, you want to make sure that you leave something out there, right? Something to linger, something to ponder. I 100% agree with you that the ending of The Sopranos was fantastic. I loved it. I loved it from the moment it happened. And I thought how, and that created a debate in my house because no one else liked it but me. But again,
see, I do think that there are, in the one or two episodes preceding it, there are some indications as to what that ending meant. And I think that's why it works, because even if you can't say for sure, there is some clue there. And it opens up an interesting sort of psychological, examination, like how you interpret something like that, what it says about you, what it says about the piece itself, they're fun. And you're right. Quiet horror, psychological horror, like a lot of Charlie Grant's short stories are like that.
I thought about him. Yeah, they are all about an impression.
And if it's done well, the reader doesn't come away with frustration. They come away with, and they don't say, "Oh, I have all these questions that are unanswered," and they're angry about it. They could say the very same sentence and say, "Oh, I have all these questions that are unanswered," and debate it and think about it and come up with, writing is a partnership. And I've said this before in class, but writing is a partnership between the author and the student, or the student. I'm sorry, I said class and I went straight to school. Author and reader, and so you kind of, I'm going to give you the story. like 98%. Come a
Right.
little bit. Use your
Right.
imagination and let's see what you come up with. And in that, the readers are engaged in the material and they feel a part of it, and they come away with this sense of a deeper understanding than just reading something or having something read to you and just walking away and it's finished. And just I think an interest in not only that reader, but other stories that not only that writer, but other stories that are similar. So from that perspective, I think the open-ended ending, as long as set up properly, is very, very successful.
And that's one of the pleasures to me, actually, about writing somewhat quieter stuff, is finding the perfect word to use, the perfect phrase, the way to construct it so that I'm sort of shepherding a reader toward a conclusion, even if I don't hand it to them,
Right.
and it's very satisfying to see people get it,
And I think it's rewarding to me as a reader when there are dots to go back and connect, and I get
Yeah.
there. I was looking it up, and there's a story by T.E.D. Klein called "Growing Things."
Yes.
And fabulous story. And it leaves you with like one little, I think, a blemish, spoiler warning, but a blemish on a cheek. But then you have to go back and think about everything you've read to interpret that. And just a powerful story for that, what it demands of you.
Well, it's I can't help but think in the ways that we're talking about unresolved endings and the demands that certain kinds of stories can place on readers, the partnership between readers and writers. I'm thinking about the ways in which kind of mainstream fiction, especially like the short story in the mainstream fiction, like over like the last, I don't know, 30 years or so, the archetypal New Yorker story, which like is not about anything, that is like consummately crafted, but leaves like at the end of it, you're like, what the hell
What just happened? Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But some of what's going on in horror, I think, is a generation of writers who not only absorbed like the heritage of the horror writers before them, but were also pulling from like the more literary, so to speak, side of things, in terms of like how to structure a story, the possibility of an unresolved ending, a focus more on character than plot. And then you wind up with this new kind of resurgent horror, which is like, working on multiple levels. It's not just fear. It's not just the gross out. It's like it's operating on a human level that was perhaps attained by other writers previously, but I think has been is more common now as a central facet of these stories. That's how it seems to me, anyway.
And I want to say that just to put out there is room for the gross out. There's
Well,
there's
like
not
Stephen King says, he'll always go
You
for
can
gross
always go
out.
for that. Yeah.
right.
Yes.
Right. I mean, there's room for it. And I mean, even as a psychological / quiet horror author, every now and then there's something gross in I mean, I may not approach it just by saying, here's the gross thing, I'll lead up to it a little differently, right? But it's still there because the story lends itself to it sometimes, right? I mean, and so we have these subgenres that break things up, and it goes back to that distinction. And you bring up Henry James, which of course you talked about one of my favorite stories ever. But we didn't have all these silos, if you will, that we had to stay within for a long time ago. And now we do. So there's a huge delta between quiet horror and extreme horror, visceral horror. And but there's room for both at the table.
And I think I think every subgenre of horror is always viable. We may see trends toward one or the other, but then something will come along and just be extreme but amazing.
Well, I remember when Clive Barker appeared on the scene.
Well, we've got a new Hellraiser that's playing with that tool set all over again.
Yeah. I mean, those first books of Blood were just like, what is this guy doing? Where is he coming from? Just incredible stuff.
Well, I think it's again, it's the excitement of the unknown. Like, I can remember the first time I read the Books of Blood, because you read Stephen King for a while. Stephen King will, and I think I tend to do this more too, where it's mostly quiet, but every once in a while there's this, like, not misplaced, but it's a scene brutal enough to set up what the threat is in the story, just to say, hey, look, I'm serious. This isn't all just bumps and creaks in the night. There's actual physical threat here, and Stephen King tends to do that. Like, there'll be like one or two scenes where you're like, oh wow, that's kind of rough, but Clive Barker's stuff just dove right into it. I mean, just swan dived into the beauty of the visceral, and the first time you read something like that, you think, like, this isn't safe escape horror. This is like, I don't know where this is going to go. I don't know if this is going to make me uncomfortable. And it's different, and you go for it because it's different. And then I think sometimes I remember teaching a group of students who had grown up post 9/11, post school shootings, where it was fairly common, that they had done the drills in case, God forbid, somebody came into their school and tried to shoot things up. They had grown up under this pall of impending horror, impending doom all the time. So to them, the visceral stuff didn't work. Like, because to them that was like reading the news. They were terrified by this more spiritual stuff like Paranormal Activity, Sinister, or like those kind of movies where it was something supernatural and just quiet enough to get under your skin. And it switches, I think, back and forth again depending on what's going on in the world. But absolutely, I mean, there are fantastic works of extreme horror, splatterpunk, quiet horror, mainstream horror. There's a lot out there, and I think part of our responsibility as writers is to make sure the world knows that there's lots of different horror out there. So if you don't like the icky, gooey, gory stuff, then try the quiet stuff, because there's beautiful stuff throughout the whole spectrum of the genre.
Right. And there's like sci-fi horror, all these mixes.
Well, that's that, Mary. You're writing that Alien book is coming out
Exactly.
very soon. So there you go. We're kind of closing in on our time, so I want to just kind of throw the chat open, and if there's any questions that anybody has for any of our panelists, type it on in there, and Melissa or I will read it. Or Melissa, if you have any thoughts about horror as a non-horror writer. Oh, I think you're muted.
I said this conversation scares the hell out of me.
Then we've been successful.
Yes. No, there was one really interesting question in the chat a few minutes ago. How do you feel about an ending that appears to be resolved and then is followed by an epilogue in which you realize, wait a minute, that's not a resolution after all? Is that too coy and cagey?
For me personally, I'm okay with that, because I think of a story like 1408, like Stephen King's 1408, or even Stephen King's The Shining, where the epilogue shows, I mean, there, for the most part, there is a happy ending, I guess, a resolution where at least some of the characters make it out alive, right? But it was reading the epilogues of those stories where it really occurred to me that for all of the stuff that we put our characters through, they wouldn't come out unscathed. There really would never be a completely, totally happy ending where everybody goes back to life the way it was before all this happened.
Yeah.
And so I think I think it's good to show that that there are lasting effects to these things, and for the same reasons we've been talking about all night. Because even with lasting effects, they still survived it. They may be carrying scars from it, but they still survived it. So I don't really have a problem with epilogues that, because to me, it's not so much undercutting the happy ending or the resolution. It's showing that, life goes on.
Deep down, it's saying, evil, we may have stopped things temporarily, but evil does not die.
Right.
the problems are not completely over, even though we've resolved one set of circumstances.
Lisa,
And that's
there's a
definitely a
question.
tool that, oh, I'm sorry, Paul, go ahead. Because my comment was not that, it really wasn't. I was literally going to talk about Flash Gordon. Keep going.
Well, we'll come back
Nice.
to that. But there's a question in the chat about what story it was that scared you so badly that you
Oh,
couldn't.
mine?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Telecommuting. I'm being honest. That story scares me silly.
Oh, okay.
Woo!
So
Telecommuting. So if anybody hangs out on my website today, telecommuting is kind of neat, and it scared me, and I'm being honest.
all right. So now tell us about Flash Gordon.
Well, I was going to make the reference to, do you remember? And I'm dating myself. I recognize this, but it was like oh my gosh, was it early 70s? Well, at the end of the movie, and it was the guy who played the priest in The Exorcist. Who's the guy who played Max van Sydow? There we go.
Yes,
Got it.
yes.
Yeah.
He
nice.
was the guy. I don't know how I just grabbed that from the air,
Yeah.
but he's the guy who was like he was the villain in Flash
That's
Gordon.
right.
And at the end, he's Ming. He's Ming. Oh my gosh, I'm getting them all. But he has his ring, and you see him looking at his ring at the end of the movie. We never got anything else from that. But this is 40 something years later, and I just said it again. I spoke of it.
Yeah.
I've spoken of it before. Those sorts of that's what an epilogue's like. It was like the very last couple of seconds of the movie, and you see him looking at this ring, and you think to yourself, "Well, it's not over." It's like Sidney just said, it's not over. And I waited for years for this to happen. Mind you, did not happen. But in an epilogue, you get that moment of, oh, we thought it was done, but it might not be. It's an excellent tool, and I think there's nothing wrong with it. Sure.
Well, and I should note, coming out this week, Halloween Ends. The end of the original Halloween, we stop Michael Myers, but then we look at the ground and he's gone.
Yeah.
And indeed, the new set of films has looked at the lasting impact of, Laurie Strode's survival. And yet all these years later, she's still affected, and the town is still affected.
Yeah. Well, that is a good stopping point, I think, for tonight. I'm going to just close us out, and I want to thank everybody. Lisa, you've got a cat behind you. I only wish we had more feline visitors in our chats.
When I sit in my office, he doesn't have the opportunity. He's always there, but he doesn't have the opportunity to be at all in the camera. But now that I'm in, what I like to call the library, it's just a bookshelf, folks, but the library, he can walk around and be behind me. So yeah.
Well, I want to thank our guests, Lisa and Mary and Sidney and Melissa, as always. Just wonderful to see you. And I wish you all a scary Halloween season.
Well, thank you for having us. This was
Thank
great.
Thank you.
Great conversation.
Yep.
Bye.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye.